The unit patch was barely visible when she opened her locker, just the corner of faded green fabric sewn inside her jacket lining catching the fluorescent light for 1 second before she closed the door again. Kandahar Province, 2015. A call sign embroidered in thread so fine most people would miss it entirely. Ashley Cooper had learned to make things disappear. 8 months at Cedar Creek Medical in San Antonio, and no one knew her middle name. No one knew she'd spent 12 years wearing a different kind of uniform. No one knew anything except what they could see: a quiet nurse who showed up on time, didn't talk much, and moved through the hallways like she was trying not to take up space. The morning shift started like every morning started. She tied her scrubs at 0600, clipped her badge to her collar, the photograph from 3 years ago, intentionally bland, hair pulled back, no distinguishing marks, and made her way to the 3rd floor. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and coffee. Someone had spilled something near the nurse's station. She could hear the ventilators humming their mechanical rhythm from the patient rooms, that steady breathing that belonged to machines, not people. Her feet made no sound on the tile. 23 years of training, and she still moved like a ghost when she needed to. Room 347 was her first stop. That was the assignment, the real assignment, the one that had nothing to do with patient charts or medication schedules. She pushed the door open with her shoulder and stepped inside, where the light fell grey and weak through half-drawn blinds. The 4-star general lay in the bed with his eyes open, staring at a point somewhere between the ceiling and nothing at all. His name was James Holloway. His rank preceded him the way a title precedes a king. His traumatic brain injury had erased the past 16 months of his memory, including the woman who dragged him 300 yards through a firefight in Sanjan Valley, Helmand Province, while bullets ate up the dirt around them both. She'd carried him to the medevac with his weight crushing her shoulders and her own blood running warm down her side from a shard of shrapnel that had missed her artery by maybe an inch. She'd pressed her hand over his wound and told him to stay conscious, told him his daughter was waiting, told him things soldiers tell each other when the world is ending. The hiss of the helicopter rotors above them. The heat coming off his body. The feeling of his hand gripping her collar so tight she thought he might tear the fabric. Now he looked through her like she was made of air. "Good morning, General," she said, keeping her voice level. Checked his full line. Noted the volume on the fluid bag, 950 milliliters remaining. Checked his catheter. Assessed his pupils with the pen light, watching them constrict, dilate, constrict again. All normal. All exactly as documented from the night shift. His eyes never found her. The cloud behind them never lifted. Vital stable, she said, more to herself than to him. Blood pressure 118/76. Heart rate 62, steady. Temperature 37.2 Celsius. Oxygen saturation 98% on room air. Everything measured, everything normal, everything except the fact that the man in this bed had no idea who she was. She'd made peace with that. Mostly. The scar on her shoulder, a reminder of the day she'd learned to make decisions in 3 seconds or die, seemed to burn a little hotter as she reached for his chart. The morning round started at 0630. That was when Dr. Marcus Pierce arrived on the 3rd floor like a man who owned the building. She saw him first from down the hall, his white coat tailored to sit at just the right angle on his shoulders, his tie a color that probably had a name like Power Burgundy or Executive Crimson. He moved with the kind of swagger that came from never being told no, from a bank account that looked like a phone number, from generations of people who looked like him making the rules and then enforcing them. His face was angular, sharp at the cheekbones and jaw, the kind of face that smiled at the right people and disappeared the others. He walked past the nurse's station without acknowledging anyone. Then he paused. His eyes tracked sideways, toward the open locker where Ashley's jacket hung. Where, just for a moment in the right light, the corner of that faded patch was visible. Special Forces green. Subdued colors. Nothing to anyone who didn't know what to look for. She felt his attention like a change in air pressure. He didn't move. Just stood there, maybe 10 feet away, watching the locker. Watching her close it. Watching her turn back to her work without meeting his eyes. His expression shifted into something that looked like recognition, but not the good kind. The kind a hunter gets when it notices movement in the grass. She didn't flinch. Didn't acknowledge him. Just logged back into the computer and pulled up the medication schedule for her assigned patients. Cooper. His voice was smooth as oil. You're on my rounds this morning. Yes, doctor, she said. Good. I want to see how you organize your notes. I've noticed some inconsistencies. He said it like he was commenting on the weather. Like it was a casual observation, not a threat. Grand rounds. 8:15. Bring your documentation. She nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. That's how you stayed invisible. That's how you didn't blow a Pentagon investigation into leaked Special Forces intelligence. That's how you kept the cover tight and the mission moving. Just say yes, do the work, don't draw attention. But the damage was already done. By 07:30, Dr. Pierce had reviewed the charts of every patient Ashley had touched in the past week. He pulled his residents around him in the hallway outside the nurses' station, 3 of them, eager young men in short white coats with the kind of hungry eyes that came from newly acquired medical degrees and not a shred of real-world wisdom. She heard him talking. Not loud, not indiscreet, just loud enough for anyone standing nearby to hear the words overreach and a dangerous practice and why she thinks she's qualified to suggest anything beyond basic vitals. The residents laughed. That small, anxious laugh of people trying to fit into a hierarchy they didn't yet understand. By 0800, the narrative was already spreading. The new nurse on 3 was trying to play doctor. Had some kind of complex. Thought she knew more than she did. One of the residents, a guy named Harrison with blonde hair and the soft hands of someone who'd never worked a full code, came up to her station and asked, very politely, if she had a moment. She had the moment. She was always making time. Dr. Pierce mentioned you might have questions about medication protocols, Harrison said. He looked uncomfortable, like he'd been given a job he didn't want to do. Is that something you've been wondering about? No, she said. Okay. I just wanted to make sure. Sometimes nurses have really good instincts, but it's important to defer to physician judgment. That's kind of the structure of how we do things. His voice had that apologetic quality of someone trapped between competing hierarchies. She recognized it. She'd heard it before, in different accents, in different countries, from people caught between different versions of authority. I understand, Ashley said. 8:15 came. Grand rounds. The residents, the attending physicians, the interns, everyone gathered around the conference table in the main meeting room on the 2nd floor. Dr. Pierce stood at the front with a laptop and a projector, his presentation already loaded. He cycled through patient files. At slide 47, he paused on one of Ashley's charts. The general's chart, specifically, the medication log for the past 72 hours. Notice anything unusual? Pierce asked. He was using his teaching voice now, the one that implied the answer was obvious to anyone with actual medical training. One of the interns raised her hand. The dosing intervals. Exactly, Pierce said. This notation here, about the 0600 morphine administration. The quantity recorded doesn't match the standard protocol for this patient's weight class. This is the kind of documentation that concerns me. Overzealous nursing staff trying to correct problems that don't exist, flagging things that are well within normal parameters. He made a soft TSK sound with his tongue. It creates work. It creates doubt. And doubt kills patients. Ashley sat in the back of the room. She didn't move. Her jaw didn't clench. Her breathing stayed even. She'd learned compartmentalization in a classroom in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where they taught you to separate the part of your brain that registered pain from the part that made decisions. The technique worked just as well for professional humiliation as it did for physical interrogation. Separate. Compartmentalize. File it away for later analysis. But Pierce wasn't finished. The vending machine conversation happened later that morning, at 10:30, when Ashley walked past a cluster of residents standing near the break room. She didn't stop. Didn't acknowledge them. Just kept moving. But Pierce's voice followed her anyway, carrying across the hallway with the precision of someone who wanted an audience without looking like he was performing. The thing about nursing is that it requires humility, he was saying. You have to understand what your scope of practice is. Suggesting differential diagnoses is not nursing. That's practicing medicine. And practicing medicine without a license, even in a subtle way, is dangerous. It's one of the reasons we have clear hierarchies in medicine. It's one of the reasons some people are doctors and some people are not. The residents laughed. That same nervous laugh. Ashley's hand stayed steady as she reached the medication cart. Her fingers moved through the compartments with mechanical precision: morphine, fentanyl, lorazepam, metoprolol. All accounted for. All locked. All documented in the system with timestamps and nurse initials. She didn't cry. Didn't retreat. Didn't even pause. By 1300, it was official. Dr. Pierce had filed a preliminary complaint with the nursing director about concerning practices and inappropriate scope creep. By 1600, Ashley had been called into a meeting with the nursing supervisor, a woman named Teresa who'd worked at Cedar Creek for 18 years and had developed the particular exhaustion of someone who'd seen every variant of physician drama at least twice. He's claiming you suggested a diagnosis to one of his medical students, Teresa said, not meeting her eyes. Is that true? I questioned his dosage calculation during grand rounds, Ashley said. In front of his residents. It was documented in the medication log. But you suggested a diagnosis. No. I asked a question about math. Teresa sighed. He's saying this is a pattern of behavior. That you're positioning yourself as more knowledgeable than the medical staff. He's asking that you be reassigned or, failing that he be permitted to restrict your access to his patients. The room went dead silent after that. Just the sound of the fluorescent lights humming their electric song, the way they did in every hospital, in every office, every clinical space. The sound of nothing happening while something very important finished breaking. What happens next? Ashley asked. We document it. We see if there are additional complaints. We review your performance metrics. It's a process. Teresa finally looked at her. For what it's worth, your evaluation scores are excellent. Your patients love you. But Pierce has relationships with the administration that go back years. And he's a good physician. If he's saying there's a problem, people will listen. Ashley nodded. She understood hierarchy. She understood how institutions protected their own. She understood that the truth was significantly less important than the appearance of proper procedure. She'd been trained by institutions that did the same thing, just with higher stakes and different uniforms. She stood up. The meeting was over. That afternoon, she returned to room 347 to check on the general. He was sleeping, his face slack with the particular emptiness of pharmaceutical unconsciousness. She adjusted his blanket. Checked his fall line again. Verified his oxygen saturation one more time. The numbers were the same as they'd been 6 hours earlier. Everything was fine. Everything was exactly as it should be. Except something had shifted. She could feel it the way you feel air pressure change before a storm. The way you sense a presence in a dark room even before you see it. Something was starting. She had no idea what was about to walk through those doors in the next 18 hours. The conference room at Cedar Creek Medical held 97 seats. Every single one was filled. Grand rounds happened every Tuesday at 7 in the morning, when the attending physicians gathered to discuss cases, challenge diagnoses, and establish dominance through intellectual superiority. Dr. Pierce lived for these moments. He stood at the podium with a laser pointer in his hand, projecting Ashley's chart onto the screen behind him, the pixels sharp and unforgiving in the fluorescent light. Notice the assessment here, Pierce said, circling her handwritten notes with the red laser dot. His voice moved like honey over gravel, smooth on the surface, rough underneath. Our nurse suggests a medication interaction. She notes subtle changes in mental status. She hypothesizes possible complications. He turned to face the residents, his expression carrying the weight of profound disappointment. Charming, really. Perhaps she's confused about which degree she holds. Laughter rippled through the room like a stone thrown into still water. The kind of laughter that wasn't quite cruel, not yet, but had cruelty buried in its foundation. Ashley sat in the back row, her hands folded on her lap, her face carved from something harder than bone. The faded unit patch, sewn inside her jacket lining months ago, pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. No one could see it. No one knew it was there. That was the point. Pierce continued, warming to his audience the way predators warm to blood in the water. Nursing is noble work. Essential work. We respect that here at Cedar Creek. But there are boundaries. Professional boundaries exist for patient safety. When someone starts believing they're qualified for diagnostic work, he paused, let the silence build, that's when we have problems. The medical students scribbled notes. The residents nodded. One of them was a woman named Dr. Simmons, sharp-eyed and ambitious, and Ashley watched her swallow hard before writing something else down. Simmons had asked Ashley a direct question 2 days ago about the general's presentation. Ashley had answered. That answer was now being used as evidence of transgression. The meeting ended at 8:15. Ashley stood and walked out while Pierce was still fielding questions, her shoes making no sound on the tile floor, a habit from 17 years of moving through spaces where stealth mattered. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee. She was halfway to the medication room when she heard his voice behind her. "You handled that well," someone said. It was Michael, one of the respiratory therapists, a Gulf War veteran who'd learned long ago that hospitals were full of battles that had nothing to do with medicine. His voice carried the kind of quiet respect that came from understanding what it meant to be watched, judged, and found wanting by people who'd never served. "Thanks," Ashley said. That's not the first time he's done something like that. She didn't respond. Responding would be acknowledgement. Acknowledgement would be weakness. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, when the hallway between the third-floor vending machines and the resident lounge became the stage for Pierce's next move. Ashley was reaching for a bottle of water when she saw him. He stood surrounded by 4 residents, his posture relaxed, his tone conversational. The tone of a man who wasn't performing cruelty, he was simply sharing observations. Fact-based observations. Nothing personal. "The captain," Pierce said, and the words landed like a punch delivered with the fist still in a pocket. "That's what I call her, you know. Because she clearly wants to command rather than follow orders. Military background probably teaches her to think she knows better than everyone else." One of the residents laughed. Not all of them. Dr. Simmons looked at her shoes. "Nursing is a calling," Pierce continued, the voice of a man explaining something obvious to children. "Most nurses understand their role. They support the physicians. They carry out orders. They document. But some people," he made a subtle gesture, not quite pointing but close enough, "some people seem to think the degree they have is just the starting point. Like it's a foundation for something bigger." Ashley stopped 3 feet away. Didn't advance. Didn't retreat. She simply existed in that space, and her presence changed the air pressure around all of them. The temperature seemed to drop 5 degrees. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Pierce turned to face her directly. His smile had teeth in it. "Why isn't nursing enough for you, Ashley? Why this desperate need to be something you're not?" 10 seconds passed. The residents held their breath. Pierce's smile wavered because he suddenly understood, in that microsecond of silence, that he'd miscalculated something fundamental. The woman in front of him wasn't intimidated. She wasn't even angry. She was something else entirely. "Your ego's writing checks your competence can't cash," Ashley said. Her voice didn't shake. Didn't rise. Sounded like a certainty, like something measured and weighed and found true. Then she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Pierce standing with his mouth half open, his audience suddenly uncertain about which direction the current was flowing. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The following week, Ashley arrived for her 0700 shift and discovered her badge wouldn't access the medication room. The fluorescent reader beeped red. Denied. She stood there, hand still raised, and waited for someone to explain. The charge nurse, a woman named Rita who'd been kind until kindness became professionally risky, wouldn't quite meet her eyes. Administrative review, she said quietly. Dr. Pierce requested restricted access pending credential verification. The words hung in the air like smoke. Credential verification. As if there was suddenly a question about whether Ashley had earned her license. As if 1 week of observation had revealed some fundamental insufficiency in her preparation. How long? Ashley asked. Director didn't specify. Ashley nodded and turned away. Her jaw was tight, that was all. Not visible unless you knew what to look for. Not visible unless you'd spent 18 years learning to read the smallest physical tells, the micro-expressions that preceded combat decisions. That afternoon, from the hallway outside Dr. Pierce's office, she watched him make 3 phone calls. His office door was open. He never looked up, never acknowledged her presence, simply spoke into the phone with the confidence of a man who understood institutional power the way a shark understands water. First call, to the chief medical officer. We have a liability situation. A nurse with military background who seems to believe her combat medic training translates to independent medical practice. Second call, to the hospital's credentialing committee. I'm requesting formal review of a staff nurse's clinical judgment patterns. Multiple instances of inappropriate diagnostic suggestions. Third call, to a board member. Not a performance issue yet. More of a professional boundary issue. Wanted to flag it before it becomes something we can't address. Then he hung up and returned to his documentation, as if he'd simply completed routine administrative work. As if he hadn't just set in motion a cascade that would restrict Ashley's access to patients, limit her assignments, and begin building a file thick enough to justify termination. But that wasn't the worst part either. The worst part came that evening, when Ashley returned to her apartment in northwest San Antonio, a small 2-bedroom with a view of the freeway, and encrypted a message to her actual handler, cover increasingly compromised. Target patient stable but access restricted. Mission parameters unchanged. Her fingers moved across the phone with mechanical precision. The general remained her assignment. Pentagon intelligence was certain someone inside Cedar Creek had leaked classified information about his transport route, the ambush that caused his traumatic brain injury. She was here to identify the source, to document the breach, to prepare the case file. She was here as a soldier. But Pierce was making sure she couldn't see him. Couldn't monitor him. Couldn't do the job she'd actually been assigned. The next morning brought something new. A memo appeared in the nursing staff room, printed and posted by someone who'd been instructed to stay anonymous. Reminder: all clinical assessments and diagnoses fall under the purview of licensed physicians. Nursing staff should limit documentation to observable data and carry out physician-ordered interventions. Questions about scope of practice should be directed to your supervisor. It was general enough that no one could claim it was directly about Ashley. But everyone knew. That was the precision of it. That was Pierce's actual competence showing through, the ability to weaponize policy, to use institutional structure as a tool, to make a person toxic without ever putting his name on the weapon. Ashley read it while standing in the break room, a cup of coffee cooling in her hand. She didn't blink. Didn't set the cup down harder than necessary. Just read it, memorized the date, and tucked the memo into her pocket. What they didn't know, what Dr. Pierce, the credentialing committee, and the board members had no way of knowing, was that Ashley had already survived much worse than administrative restrictions. Dr. Pierce found the nursing director in the break room at 18:47 hours, 2 folders tucked under his arm like weapons. His voice was calm, almost regretful. "We need to talk about Ashley Cooper." He opened the first folder, a manufactured list of incidents, each one carefully curated from weeks of chart reviews. Here. And here. And here. His finger traced down the page, pointing to entries that twisted her clinical observations into overreach. A notation about acetaminophen dosing she'd questioned in a patient file. Her suggestion about differential diagnosis for a pneumonia presentation. A note in the margin where she'd questioned a medication timing. None of it was wrong. All of it looked damning when arranged this way, like evidence of a nurse practicing medicine without a license. The nursing director's face darkened as she read. I didn't include the incident from yesterday, Pierce continued, out of professional courtesy. But the pattern is clear. For patient safety, I think we need to document this formally. He said it the way a surgeon might say they needed to remove a tumor, regretful necessity, not vengeance. The nursing director nodded slowly. She didn't know that Pierce had been collecting these moments for weeks, that he'd reviewed hundreds of Ashley's charts looking for ammunition, that every single observation had been legitimate nursing practice in a complex case. What she saw was a conscientious doctor protecting patients. By 1923 hours, the decision was made. Ashley arrived for her shift at 2,100 hours expecting her usual patient load, room 312, room 333, room 347, and 4 others on the west corridor. Instead, the charge nurse handed her a revised assignment sheet. Pierce requested the changes this afternoon, she said, not meeting Ashley's eyes. Room 312 and room 333 were gone. Reassigned to 2 other nurses. The words on the paper felt like a deliberate pruning, a way of saying you can't be trusted with serious cases anymore. Ashley's jaw tightened, barely perceptible, a muscle tensing and releasing, but she accepted the sheet without comment. She understood the escalation. First, public humiliation. Then restricted access. Now isolation. He was building a case piece by piece, removing her from patient contact while maintaining plausible deniability. Patient safety concerns, the reassignment would be coded. Not punishment. Never punishment. Just precaution. She still had room 347, the general, because that assignment predated Pierce's campaign and removing it directly would raise questions. But her influence was shrinking, her authority being systematically dismantled in front of the entire night shift staff. They watched. They whispered. The message was spreading, don't trust the nurse with the quiet voice and the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining. At 20:34 hours, Pierce called the nursing director at her home. She was in her living room, feet up, watching the evening news when her work phone lit up. I apologize for calling after hours, Pierce began, his voice smooth as oil over water. But I felt this couldn't wait. I've been reviewing Ashley Cooper's chart documentation from the past 8 months. There are patterns. Subtle, but concerning. He described the acetaminophen questioning as if it were a near-miss incident. He reframed her diagnostic suggestions as scope creep. He mentioned, almost parenthetically, that some of the residents had approached him expressing discomfort with her confidence in critical situations. None of it was true. The residents respected her. The patient's outcomes were excellent. But truth moved slower than narrative, especially when the narrative came from a doctor with 17 years at Cedar Creek and a reputation built on surgical excellence. I think we need to formally review her schedule, Pierce continued. Pull her from complex cases temporarily. For compliance purposes. I'm not saying there's been an actual breach, but prevention is better than remediation, wouldn't you agree? The nursing director said she'd look into it first thing in the morning. Pierce thanked her and ended the call. By 20:47 hours, the weaponization of administrative process was already in motion. It was elegant, really, not a direct attack, but a slow institutional suffocation. No one could accuse him of harassment. He was simply a concerned physician flagging safety issues. The fact that those issues were manufactured, exaggerated, or outright false wouldn't matter by the time the formal review was complete. What they didn't know was that Dr. Pierce was already making the third call. At 2,156 hours, he reached Bernard Castelliano, hospital board member and retired oil executive. "Bernie, I hate to bother you at home, but I have a patient safety concern that needs board-level attention." He explained, in measured, professional tones, that a nurse at Cedar Creek had been demonstrating increasingly aggressive clinical decision-making, that she was questioning physician orders, that she'd made what could charitably be called diagnostic suggestions to residents and attending physicians. "The concerning part," Pierce said, letting just the right amount of worry into his voice, "is that she seems to have convinced some of the younger physicians she knows better than they do. I've documented several instances where she's inserted herself into treatment decisions outside her scope of practice." He mentioned the needle incident from 3 weeks prior, when Ashley had caught a medication error in real time and prevented a potential adverse event. He reframed it as her overstepping boundaries. "I'm not suggesting anything criminal," Pierce said carefully. "But I think we need to be proactive before something worse happens. I'd hate to see Cedar Creek in the news because we ignored the warning signs." By 22:03 hours, Castellano said he'd bring it to the Credentials Committee. The second call came at 2241 hours. Dr. Margaret Lee, board member and infectious disease specialist at UT Health. Pierce used almost the exact same language, the same careful construction of concern masquerading as care. "I wouldn't normally escalate something like this," he told her, "but I think the board should be aware. We may have a compliance issue developing in nursing." He walked her through his curated evidence, the charts, the observations, the manufactured pattern of overreach. "The concerning part," he said again, using the same phrase, the same intonation, "is the influence she seems to have with residents. That's where it becomes a systemic problem." By 22:56 hours, Dr. Lee had agreed to flag it at the next Credentials meeting. The third call came at 2319 hours. James Wright, board member and commercial real estate investor. Pierce knew Wright would be the easiest. Wright cared primarily about liability and liability insurance. "Jim, I need to alert you to a potential exposure we have brewing at Cedar Creek." He focused this version on risk management, a nurse with questionable judgment making clinical suggestions to physicians, potential malpractice exposure if something went wrong, the hospital's vulnerability if her actions resulted in adverse events. He didn't need to prove anything to Wright. He only needed to plant the seed of financial risk. "I've been documenting everything," Pierce said, which was technically true. He had been documenting, though the documentation was selective and manipulated. "But I think leadership should know we may have a problem." By 23:27 hours, Wright had already texted the hospital CEO asking about credentialing compliance protocols. 15 doctors would eventually gather outside room 347, but it would take a crisis to bring them together. For now, Pierce's campaign operated in shadows and private phone calls, in carefully worded documentation and selective storytelling. Ashley moved through the night shift with her reduced patient load, checking vitals, administering medications, watching the general sleep with the kind of attention that came from muscle memory and combat training. She could feel the institutional walls closing in, subtle but unmistakable. By 0100 hours, she'd heard from 2 different residents that Pierce had been asking questions about her clinical judgment. By 0147 hours, the charge nurse had quietly mentioned that her schedule was being reviewed. By 0200 hours, Ashley sat in the break room for exactly 4 minutes, hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, and allowed herself to recognize the trap she was in. She couldn't blow her cover. Couldn't reveal that she was here on a Pentagon assignment monitoring the general security during his rehabilitation. Couldn't explain that the clinical suggestions Pierce was weaponizing had prevented medication errors and caught subtle changes in patient status that the attending physicians had initially missed. Couldn't tell anyone that her instincts were honed by 12 years of Special Forces training where noticing details meant the difference between coming home and a flag-draped coffin. She was bound by classification and protocol and the mission parameters that had placed her here in the first place. All she could do was maintain her composure, document her observations, and wait for Pierce's campaign to either conclude or escalate. All she could do was watch the general sleep in room 347, see the tattoo on his forearm that read AC, a Kandahar angel, and remember that he'd once known exactly who she was. That was before the traumatic brain injury. That was before she became invisible. That was before Dr. Pierce decided that her quiet competence was a threat to his authority. By 02:47 hours, things were about to change. But not in any way Pierce had planned. But that wasn't the worst part. At 02:47 hours, Ashley pushed through the double doors of the third-floor corridor, her rounds reduced now to the skeleton shift Pierce had orchestrated, half her patients reassigned, a schedule carved into pieces like a carcass left for scavengers. Room 347 was dark except for the pale glow of the monitor. She moved toward it on instinct, the kind that kept soldiers alive in places where mistakes became body bags. The general's breathing pattern had changed. She knew it before she saw it, a sixth sense honed across 3 tours, across 1,000 nights reading the small signals between life and death. His chest rose and fell in an asymmetrical rhythm. The right side of his ribcage moved less than the left, a subtle betrayal of physics that meant pressure was building where pressure had no business being. She approached the bed and placed her stethoscope against his right chest wall. Nothing. Dead air where breath sounds should whisper like wind through canyon walls. Then she moved to the left. Clear. The difference was absolute. Tension pneumothorax. The general's left lung was compressed by air trapped in his pleural space, pressure accumulating with every breath he took, slowly suffocating him from the inside out. His oxygen saturation hadn't dropped yet, the monitor still read 94%, but that window was closing like a fist. Maybe 10 minutes before his heart rate climbed. Maybe 5 before cardiac arrest became inevitable. Ashley didn't reach for the call button. She reached for the 14-gauge needle in the crash cart, her hands moving with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed this procedure before, not on a training dummy in a controlled setting, but on a bleeding soldier in a convoy on a road outside Kandahar where the ambient temperature was 118 degrees and the medevac was still 23 minutes out and hesitation was a luxury that got people killed. The on-call resident stood frozen in the doorway, his tablet slack at his side, his mouth open in the shape of a question he couldn't quite form. Ashley didn't wait for permission. She didn't ask. She prepared the site with a chlorhexidine swab, found the second intercostal space along the midclavicular line, and drove the needle through the skin and into the pleural cavity with a single deliberate motion. The hiss of released pressure was immediate. Loud. Unmistakable. Like air escaping from a tire at 30 miles per hour, like breath held for too long finally exhaled, like a door opening that had been jammed shut. The general's color returned within seconds. Not gradually. Not slowly. Within the space of 3 heartbeats, the gray-blue pallor of oxygen deprivation receded and healthy pink flooded back into his face. His oxygen saturation climbed, 95%, 96%, 98%. His heart rate, which had begun its climb toward tachycardia, steadied. The monitor showed a man who was going to live, who might have been dead in minutes without the procedure Ashley had just performed in the dark with a needle and muscle memory and nothing else. The resident finally found his voice. "I need to call." "You need to do nothing," Ashley said quietly. "Get me a chest tube set up. 28 French. And call thoracic surgery. Tell them we have a post-traumatic pneumothorax, now decompressed, but he's going to need definitive management. Move." The resident moved. The corridor outside room 347 was about to become a very crowded place. They started arriving within 90 seconds. Night shift nurses. The duty physician from the ER. The internal medicine team who'd been charting in the conference room. The residents rotating through surgery. The hospitalist group. The attending cardiologists. By 02:58, the hallway outside room 347 had transformed into something that resembled a parade, white coats and scrubs and the kind of human density that happens when 15 doctors converge on a single crisis scene, each of them moving in the direction of the emergency, each of them carrying the weight of authority and institutional knowledge and the absolute certainty that they needed to know what had just happened. Ashley counted them without looking up from the general's chest. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Exactly 15. A wall of them standing in the doorway and pressed against the windows, watching her work with the expression of people who had just witnessed something that existed outside their carefully constructed understanding of hospital hierarchy and competence and the rigid boundaries of a nurse's lane. Then came the silence. The sound of someone arriving who commanded rooms without speaking. Dr. Pierce stepped through the crowd at 0301, his eyes moving from the monitor to the general's pink returning face to the needle still in Ashley's hand. His gaze lingered there, on her hands, on the space where she stood, on the undeniable fact that his campaign to remove her had just collided with the reality that she had saved this man's life in the time it took most people to brew a cup of coffee. His jaw clenched. Once. Twice. "Everyone out except medical staff," he announced. His voice moved like a blade, sharp and cold and cutting through the crowd with institutional weight. Now. The residents scattered. The nurses retreated. The 15 doctors became 10, then 8, then 5 observers standing at the threshold, their presence the only form of documentation that mattered now, the silent record that they had seen what happened, that they knew the sequence of events, that the lie he was about to construct would have to be built on top of their collective witness. Pierce turned to Ashley. His smile was a thing designed to be a weapon, all teeth and no warmth, the expression of a man who understood that direct attacks had failed and now required something more methodical. "You're done," he said. "Don't touch another patient. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The tone was everything, a funeral bell tolling in 3 words, the casket closing on 8 months of work. "Get her out of here," he said to the charge nurse. Then his phone appeared in his hand. He was dialing before Ashley had finished stepping away from the bedside, his voice already moving through her destruction like a man reading a prepared statement. "I need you to pull the emergency credentialing file on Ashley Cooper, RN. Yes, right now. She just performed an unsupervised invasive procedure without attending physician authorization, and I need a detailed review of her training credentials and scope of practice. No, I don't care if it's 3 in the morning. This is a patient safety issue." He made another call. Then another. By 03:15, he had reassigned all of her remaining patients to other nurses, had somehow found the chief nursing officer's home number and delivered a message about significant patient safety violations and scope creep, and had prepared a formal incident report that would find its way into her file before sunrise, a document that transformed a life-saving procedure into evidence of recklessness, a life-saving intervention into a criminal act of practicing medicine without a license. The other nurses wouldn't meet her eyes as she packed her bags from the break room locker. She could feel their discomfort radiating like heat, the fear that association with her might constitute guilt by proximity, the institutional instinct to distance themselves from someone who had just committed the cardinal sin of competence in the presence of institutional hierarchy. By 0600, the paperwork was complete. Suspension pending investigation. Her badge deactivated. Her access revoked. The faded unit patch was visible again as she folded her jacket in silence, the patch from the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, the one from a place and time she wasn't supposed to admit existed, the one sewn into the lining where it could stay hidden and close to her heart and completely invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for it. She drove home in the grey light before dawn, rain beginning to fall on the windshield, the city of San Antonio still sleeping behind her. The apartment was silent. Everything was silence now. At 1400, her daughter Emma found her at the kitchen table, the chair turned toward the window, Ashley's hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours earlier. "Mommy." Emma's voice was the sound of a child who had learned to recognize the shape of her mother's defeat. "Why are you home early?" Ashley's throat closed. The question contained 1,000 smaller questions. Why are you still in scrubs? Why is your hair still wet from the hospital shower? Why is your face doing that thing where you're trying not to cry? Why are you home when you're supposed to be saving people? She pulled her 8-year-old close, this child who believed her mother was just a nurse, who didn't know about Kandahar or silver stars or the way certain kinds of courage could get you removed from the very place where you were supposed to protect people. Emma smelled like sleep and the orange juice she'd had for breakfast, and Ashley held onto her the way she would hold onto a rope if she were drowning. "Did you help someone?" Emma asked, studying her mother's face with the ruthless clarity of children. Ashley's hands trembled. Not from fear. Not from the weight of institutional destruction or the knowledge that her mission was collapsing or the understanding that she'd just watched 15 doctors stand silent while a man with institutional power dismantled her in front of their eyes. The trembling was restraint, the physical manifestation of everything she wasn't allowed to say, everything she couldn't explain, everything that had to stay buried inside the space where Special Forces captains learned to compartmentalize survival. "I tried," she said finally. Her voice was steady now, the shake gone, replaced by something harder. "I tried very hard." Emma kissed her forehead and went to her room, satisfied by this answer in the way children are satisfied when the adults around them are clearly broken and there's nothing to be done about it except accept it. Ashley sat alone at the kitchen table as the rain intensified outside, as the morning dissolved into afternoon, as the weight of everything she couldn't say pressed down like a physical thing, like a hand on her chest, like something she would have to carry alone. The rain kept falling through the afternoon and into the evening, the kind of relentless San Antonio downpour that turned the parking lot into a mirror of gray sky. Ashley sat motionless at the kitchen table, her phone dark beside her hand, the notification she'd been waiting for not yet arrived. At Cedar Creek Medical, Dr. Pierce was already moving through his endgame with the precision of a man who'd spent 3 months planning this exact moment. He called the nursing director at 0630 the next morning, before the day shift briefing, his voice carrying that particular blend of concern and vindication that made every administrative call feel like a mercy. "I've documented 12 separate instances of protocol violations," he said, not mentioning that 9 of those instances were manufactured, that he'd altered timestamps on her charts to create a false pattern, that his documentation was an architecture of lies designed to look like evidence. "I'm recommending immediate suspension pending a full review of her credentials. I've also pulled her complete schedule for the past 8 months. There are gaps, inconsistencies, moments where she was off the unit without documented break relief." The nursing director, exhausted from being called at home twice before, agreed without resistance. Pierce wasn't asking for permission anymore. He was announcing fait accompli, the strategic move of a man who'd already decided the outcome and was simply informing the bureaucracy of its role in delivering it. By 0830, the hospital's routine background audit ran its automated scan. Every employee flagged for security clearance renewal, every military affiliation cross-checked against current employment status. When Ashley's file appeared in the system, flagged with a classified Pentagon designation, the automated alert triggered immediately. The suspension notification had already been filed. The security clearance holder was now on unpaid administrative leave. That discrepancy alone, a suspended employee with active classified access, generated 7 simultaneous escalation protocols, each one routing the file higher, faster, past Pierce's control, past his knowledge, into the hands of people who understood the implications of classified operations at civilian hospitals. Ashley was packing the last of her things from her locker when the text came through at 0920. Not from the hospital. From a number she'd been trained to answer at 0400 if needed. 2 words, clear assignment. She understood immediately. The Pentagon knew. The automated audit had triggered the cascade. Her cover was blown, not by her, but by the very system Pierce had tried to weaponize against her. She had exactly 4 hours to say goodbye to the general before the DOD liaison arrived to extract her from the assignment and begin the investigation into how her cover had been compromised. The rage she'd been holding back for 3 months, the controlled, military-trained fury that had kept her functional, crystallized into something cold and purposeful. Pierce had tried to destroy her without understanding what she actually was. Worse, he'd tried to destroy her by attacking the one patient she couldn't protect because she couldn't reveal why she was protecting him. She walked into room 347 at 10:47, and the general was awake. His eyes were open in a way they hadn't been for weeks, the traumatic brain injury still present but the fog lifting like weather clearing, like something breaking through. His name was James Morrison. 4-star General, Joint Special Operations Command Liaison, and the man whose transport route had been leaked to insurgents, whose Black Hawk had gone down outside Sanjin Valley with Ashley dragging him 300 yards through machine gun fire while her own team laid down suppression. The man who'd never, in all these weeks of rehabilitation, remembered her name. Reaper 6, he whispered when she entered, his voice rough from weeks of minimal speech. That was her call sign. That was the code name from Kandahar, from the operation that still didn't officially exist, from the mission that had gotten him shot down and gotten her tattooed with his name because that's what you did when you carried someone's blood into your skin. His eyes cleared another degree, and recognition flooded across his face like sunrise. Captain Cooper. How long have you been? His voice cracked. You've been here the whole time. She didn't answer. She couldn't. But she was still in her scrubs, still maintaining the cover for the next 4 hours, still carrying the weight of the classified assignment even as it crumbled around her. She was reaching for his hand when the elevator doors opened 3 times in rapid succession, and the hospital went very still. A Marine colonel entered first, dress blues immaculate, his rank pins catching the overhead lights with sharp precision. Behind him came a Pentagon staffer in a charcoal suit, and behind her came Marcus Webb, the hospital's IT administrator, holding a sealed envelope that contained 48 hours of work. The colonel stepped to the bedside of the general, who struggled to sit upright despite the 4 lines, despite the residual weakness from his injuries, because protocol dictated respect be paid with posture. Captain Ashley Cooper, the colonel said, his voice carrying the formal weight of military ceremony. Your service record is being released from classified status effective immediately. I'm reading your citation from the operational report filed 6 months ago. Captain Ashley Cooper, Special Forces, demonstrated extraordinary heroism under fire in Kandahar province, rendering aid to a superior officer while engaging enemy combatants at close range, sustaining wounds, and continuing mission despite compromise. Recommendation for Silver Star and promotion to captain rank, effective immediately upon completion of current assignment. He paused. Every doctor who had stood in that hallway 17 hours earlier, all 15 of them, had quietly followed the activity into room 347. Pierce was not among them. Your assignment is complete, Captain. Welcome home. The general, despite the 4 lines and the residual confusion from his brain injury, managed a salute, a fist to the center of his chest, the kind of salute given in operating rooms and transport helicopters and places where ceremony was the only language left. You saved me twice, he said, his voice steady now, his mind finally returning from whatever distance the traumatic brain injury had created. Once in the sand. Once here. Dr. Pierce was in his office when he realized. The hospital IT administrator had filed a formal report at 09:45 that morning, 40 minutes after the background audit triggered Ashley's clearance notification. Marcus Webb, Gulf War vet, intelligence analyst by training, had been watching Pierce for 8 weeks. Had noted the pattern. Had understood what was happening before Pierce even fully understood it himself. The security footage Pierce began deleting at 1100, the recordings of Grand Round's humiliation, of the vending machine conversations, of the medication room access restriction he'd ordered, was already backed up to a secure server. Every frame. Every timestamp. Every whispered cruelty about the nurse who was practicing medicine without a license. By 1430, the medical board had suspended his license pending investigation. By 1600, the DOD liaison had cross-referenced Pierce's phone records against the intelligence breach investigation and found 17 calls to a contractor who'd sold the general's transport route for $23,000. Pierce wasn't just a petty tyrant destroying a nurse. He was the security threat. He'd been targeting Ashley because her proximity to the general threatened his access, because she was competent enough to notice inconsistencies, because she was dangerous to his operation. The criminal investigation took 48 hours. The hospital termination took 12. His wife served divorce papers citing criminal charges. The board members who'd taken his calls blocked his number. The colleagues who'd laughed at his jokes wouldn't return his messages. Cedar Creek Medical issued a formal statement acknowledging its failure to implement adequate protections against systematic retaliation. The 15 doctors submitted letters to the medical board detailing what they'd witnessed, what they should have questioned, what they'd accepted without resistance. 6 months later, Ashley walked through the glass doors of San Antonio Community College, through the hallway lined with CPR certification postings, past the classroom where Dr. Pierce taught the only course his suspended license permitted. She wore her dress uniform. Captain's bars polished. The faded Kandahar patch, the one sewn inside her jacket lining, the one Pierce had never understood carried a meaning he couldn't touch, was framed on General Morrison's wall at SOUTHCOM headquarters, fully recovered, memory intact, mission understood. She didn't slow down as she passed his classroom. Didn't acknowledge him looking up from the plastic training torso, didn't register the moment he saw her and froze. He was practicing chest compressions on a dummy. She was walking toward her next assignment, her daughter finally understanding why Mommy had been crying, why the world had seemed to end that afternoon at the kitchen table. Emma had asked one question at the ceremony where Ashley received her commendation: "Did you help him?" Yes. She'd helped him twice. Once from enemy fire. Once from the enemy within. Marcus Webb, the IT administrator who'd saved the footage, received a Civilian Service Award. The 15 doctors who'd stood in that hallway submitted their letters. The protocols changed. The quiet person in the room was finally holding everything together in plain sight, no longer invisible, no longer mistaken for less than what she was. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet people nobody sees until they have to. Like this video, and tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?